Okay, welcome to another edition of the Edlow Podcast. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I know I say this every single time. I do. I acknowledge it. I will take accountability for it, but I'm really excited about this podcast too. I have Stephen Kinzer. Mr. Kinzer, welcome to the Edlow Podcast.
Good to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Great. So just so people who may not know your work, Stephen Kinzer is an American journalist, author, a former foreign correspondent, best known for his reporting on U.S. foreign policy, international affairs, and historical interventions abroad. He worked for the New York Times for more than 20 years, serving as bureau chief in places including Nicaragua, Germany, and Turkey. His most widely known books are All the Shah's Men, which is about the CIA-backed overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammed. I don't know how to say it. Mossadegh. Is that how you say that? Mossadegh. Okay. Yeah. Overthrow or History of American-backed regime change operations. The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers and Cold War foreign policy. Poisoner in Chief, which was the reason why I reached out to you on the CIA's MKUltra program, and Bitter Fruit, about the 1954 coup in Guatemala. And while we're at it, we'll just add, you got one coming out. You got one coming out shortly in October. Boiling Point: How America Brought War to Ukraine. So I'm excited because totally on topic for American current events. So, so Mr. Kinzer, let me ask you, how do you think it's going?
What do you mean by it?
Yeah, how do you think American foreign policy currently is going?
Well, we're careening wildly. I think we're in a moment of tremendous change, not just in America's approach to the world, but in the whole way the world is geopolitically organized. We're seeing dramatic changes in the Middle East as we speak. Um, I don't know where this is all going, but I wonder if we might finally be breaking free of some of the Democrat Republican policies that have led the United States to intervene in so many countries over so many years, so far away from our own borders. Our foreign policy is essentially a matter of identifying enemies in the world and then coming up with ways to fight them. We might be transitioning to
Mm.
a world in which we feel like we can live with other countries without having to bomb them. And if that's the case, which I think is still quite uncertain, that would certainly be a wonderful step.
Yeah. Interesting to hear you say that considering we just dropped a bunch of bombs on Iran. And so how do you feel like, I mean, you are probably one of the best experts. You've studied this since the Iranian Revolution and before. Like, do you think that um that is going to be help or hurt us moving forward?
The bombing of Iran was a terrible idea. There was no reason to do that. There was no threat to the United States. And we shouldn't be involved in such destructive military action unless we're defending our country. Nonetheless, uh, putting aside the horrors of that bombing campaign, it seems to have produced quite a shakeup in the Middle East, and in particular, strengthening Iran's position. Like Iran emerges from our bombing exactly the opposite from what the White House had hoped. We had hoped this regime would disappear. Instead, there's a new version of it, which is perhaps more militant
Mm.
and more assertive and more willing to exercise its uh, role in the region. So I think we're at a possibility now where there could be more integration among the Muslim countries of the Middle East rather than placing Iran as kind of an outsider. And if this leads to the Americans taking their thumb off the scale in Middle East conflicts and allowing Middle Eastern countries to work out their own problems among themselves, I think that would be a very positive step. Might be going in that direction, but everything's changing day to day or hour to hour, so prediction is difficult.
I've said to a couple people when I talk about this, particularly about Donald Trump, and I know we're getting a little off topic before we go. I promise we'll get back to it. But one of the things that I'm a political science major. I went to law school, so I'm an attorney, and I studied politics in general here at Sacramento State University, and I think that the thing that's so fascinating is how Donald Trump has really disrupted, as you said, the typical Democrat Republican kind of way of doing things. He's just complete I think he might be the most influential president of my generation moving forward, and I'm very curious to see how journalists and historians 30, 40 years from now view his presidency. Do you kind of agree with some of that? Do you think that he's really disrupted the way politics, the normal politics have been practiced, I guess you could say?
Absolutely. When you hear about comments coming out of this administration about Israel or about NATO, those are words that you would have never heard from a Democrat or a Republican
Mhm.
anytime before now. So I think the tradition that has bound the two parties together around a single foreign policy over all the period since the end of the Second World War, more or less, might be dissolving. And
Yeah.
Trump is definitely blowing up the consensus, much to the consternation of people in Washington. And in the end, this might be a positive development. But as you said, there's still a long way to go. So let's wait and see.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. I remember before him and even I would say before Barack Obama, I remember as a young voter, I remember saying to myself, and I thought I was joking, but I was like, "I bet people would vote for almost anybody, even if they were saying weird, crazy stuff or even lying, as long as we thought he believed what he was saying." And I just, maybe I don't believe necessarily now think that Donald Trump believes everything he's saying, but I think the fact that he was just different the way Barack Obama was different, when Barack Obama got voted in, I was in law school when he won his first election, and I remember people being so excited that he didn't look or act or speak like everybody else, and I think that Donald Trump might be the antithesis of that. Have you seen that? I mean, you've been around politics for a long time. Do you see that we're seeing that really it's more about change than even maybe policy?
Well, it's certainly true that the Obama presidency did not result in dramatic reorientations of American foreign policy,
Mm,
although he did make positive outreaches to Cuba and Iran. Um, I think that what we're seeing with Trump is much more disruptive and has much more potential to
mm,
produce a different world in a
mm.
positive way. So I think we are off the paradigm much further than we ever were with Obama. And it's terrifying, but a potentially very exciting moment of political and geopolitical change.
Yeah, I agree. Well, one of the reason I had you come on was because I'm very fascinated about MKUltra and CIA operations. But first, I wanted to ask, you've spent decades really studying covert operations. What was it that first convinced you to get into that?
I spent many years, as you mentioned earlier, as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times.
Hmm.
Um, and therefore, my education about world affairs and about America's role in the world did not come from graduate school, congressional staff, think tank in Washington, work for the Defense Department or the State Department, and hang around in that atmosphere of Washington. I learned about America's role in the world from people who were the victims of it, from people who were
Mm,
the subjects of American foreign policy, from the people that
mm,
were underneath the bombs that we were dropping. So,
mm,
that gave me a different view of the way the United States works in the world, maybe a view from a different perspective, certainly not the Washington perspective. Um, and I've always been interested in trying to figure out what really happens behind the curtain. I realized early on in my career as a foreign correspondent that what we see is not all of what's happening. There's a
mm,
lot going on that we don't see. So, how could I get at that? And actually, my book about MK Ultra, Poisoner in Chief, is also a result of that. So
mm,
the origin goes back to my study of American intervention. Uh, in my book about the Dulles brothers, there's a little section, a paragraph or two, about a time when the CIA uh, decided to assassinate the prime minister of the Congo,
mm,
Patrice Lumumba, in
mm,
1960. And in this little paragraph or little section that I wrote in that book, I mentioned that the CIA sent poison to its station in the Congo for use in poisoning the prime minister. Later on, I began to think, who would have carried that poison? That's quite a job. You've got a bag of poison, which is intended to kill the leader of another country with which have diplomatic relations. Um, who would have done that? Would that have been some kind of special courier? But then I discovered that it wasn't a courier. It was actually the guy who was the head of the CIA chemical branch, a guy named Sidney Gottlieb. And Gottlieb was also the director of MKUltra. So,
Yeah.
uh, as the head of the chemical division of the CIA, Gottlieb was in charge of making all those poison pills that you read about, like the poisons that we tried to use to kill Castro, or poison pills that we would give to spies to kill themselves if they were captured. Um, that's where I got this title for the book, Poisoner in Chief, because that's what Gottlieb was. However, as I began to look into Gottlieb, I realized that what little is known about him and what little has been pinned on him, it's actually not that important. That's all the stuff about the assassinations, about making the poisons. So if Gottlieb had never existed, somebody else would have done that job. That's
Mm,
really just a job for a pharmacist. If you
mhm.
want to make poison and you have access to everything, you can make poison. But I began to realize that making poisons to kill foreign leaders was just a tiny part of Gottlieb's job. His real big job was running and conceiving and directing MK Ultra. And that was a project that came entirely from within his own mind, unlike the making poisons, which was just essentially fulfilling a prescription. So I realized that we'd missed the point to the extent that anybody knew anything about Gottlieb. That the real story was not that he made poison pills. The real story was MK Ultra, which was probably the most extreme program the CIA ever launched. And I concluded that Sidney Gottlieb was probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. He had what amounted to a license to kill issued by the US government. And that
Right.
puts it in a very small category. So I realized that this was a real untold story, and untold stories is what I'm all about.
It's so interesting that you bring what I started thinking about as you were just talking was when you say it's almost shocking to the conscience to hear the guy who is creating poisons designed to kill other world leaders is really not as important as this other thing that he's doing. Like, I mean, that just goes to show you how insane this story is that like, yeah, sure, he was poisoning other world leaders and killing them. But he also had this other thing in his mind that he was doing on Americans that was even more sinister and shocking and backed by the US government. And so, tell us, you mentioned Sidney Gottlieb is not very well known and probably the most important unknown person in the 20th century. So, what did you think was, like, the biggest, most interesting things that you learned about him doing your research in prep for Poisoner in Chief?
When I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I came across what I think might be the very first CIA secret prison or black site. It's in a chateau outside of Frankfurt that looks really nice, like a B&B or something. I went over there and I found the guy that owned the place now, a young German businessman,
Mhm.
and he took me down into the basement to show me his storage rooms. And he told me these were the cells where the CIA torturers carried out their experiments alongside their partners who were Nazi doctors who only a few years earlier had been conducting these same kinds of experiments in the concentration camps just down the road.
Man.
So that's an expression of the fact that the Nazi concentration camp doctors and their Japanese equivalents were a foundation of MK Ultra. So when Gottlieb took it over like a good scientist, he made a couple of basic beginning questions. The first one was, how do we approach the idea of mind control? That was the goal of MKUltra, and he concluded that before you could figure out a way to implant another mind into someone's brain, you first had to find a way to destroy the mind that was in there. You had to find ways to destroy a human mind and a human body. And this Americans didn't have huge amounts of data on that. They didn't know, for example, is the same amount of sarin gas necessary to kill a child as is necessary to kill an adult? Because to find those things out, you have to kill people.
Right.
But the Nazis had done all those experiments and killed lots of people. So they had this knowledge, and they brought that over to the CIA, and it became part of MKUltra. So the Nazi foundation of this project is especially interesting. Um, also, I found that one way that Gottlieb and his CIA superiors were able to justify the extreme tortures that they inflicted on people, including tortures that led to death, uh, was that they decided that America was in such a dire, urgent situation that normal rules of conduct had to be put aside. At
Mhm.
that time, don't forget, we were at the height of the Cold War, early 1950s. Americans were told to believe, and most did believe, that the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an absolute mortal combat. Only one could survive. And if the Soviets were victorious, it would not only mean the end of the United States, but it would mean the end of all possibility for meaningful human life on Earth, because every human on Earth would be controlled by automaton, would be an automaton controlled by some commissar in the Kremlin. So if you believed that,
Right.
then the loss of a few lives or a few hundred lives would be a small price to pay. And I think that's one of the lessons we can take from MKUltra to today, which is don't allow your exaggerated fears to propel you into horrific projects that actually don't produce results other than staining the reputation of the United States and destroying countless human lives.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring this up because you ever watch the show The Walking Dead?
Uh,
Okay. One of the things I found really interesting about The Walking Dead, especially at the beginning, was this push-pull between what were the ethics of this new world in The Walking Dead. So it seemed to me, I always used to joke, I'd be like, whoever the voice of conscience is, on the show is the next one who's gonna die, right? And I can't remember his name, he was the older man with the trailer, and he was talking with the main characters. And as they were talking, he would always talk about how, no, we're not these people. We're not these people. But it was a different world. And they were justifying doing pretty horrific things because of the new world they were in. And it sounds like it's kind of what Sidney Gottlieb and his people were doing to justify their behavior was we're in this new world that's a different category and it's us versus them. And it's okay for us to do these generally horrific things. And my question with all of that really, is I've found that humans in general, especially doing this podcast, never are all one thing. Like, they're never all villain, they're never all hero. There's something in between. When I hear about Sidney Gottlieb, it sounds like he is just a demented, crazy villain. But did your research find something more complicated than that?
it certainly did. But let me go back to something you mentioned earlier, and then we get back to Gottlieb. You said that on that TV show, you got the feeling that the person with conscience was the next one to die.
Right.
This actually refers or could refer to one of the major episodes in the history of MK Ultra.
Mm,
So there were only a very small number of scientists involved in this project. And their job was making poisons and watching them be administered to people, including people who then died as a result of their tortures or experiments, let's call them. Um, there was one scientist who began to have second thoughts.
mhm,
This was a guy named Frank Olson.
Mhm.
Olson actually was in England and I believe watched a subject die after he was administered a poison that Olson had created. It troubled him, and he was. Uh, it's a long story, to which I devote a full chapter in Poisoner in Chief. But the short of it is that af- after Frank Olson expressed his desire not only to quit MKUltra, but to quit the CIA, and even asked one of his friends, "Do you know a good journalist?" uh, he became a very dangerous figure for the CIA. He was
Mhm.
carrying around secrets that, if revealed, would have not only devastated the CIA, but would have devastated the United States and its position in the world. On a November night in 1953, Frank Olson, who was in a hotel room with the deputy director of MKUltra, went out the window and was killed when he hit the ground.
Mm.
Uh, Now, this was originally described as the suicide of an army scientist. He
Ah,
wasn't an army scientist, he was a
yeah,
CIA scientist, and the allegation that it was suicide has now come under very heavy suspicion. It's very likely or possible, or reasonable, that, Olson had some help going out that window.
yeah.
The person with the conscience also exposes himself, in real life just as in fiction. Now, you asked about Gottlieb, and he really is a fascinating character. When you're writing a biography, you're more or less living with the person. And I write in a very small room, so there I was with Gottlieb for a, a long time,
Mhm.
um, and I think I got to know him as well as anybody that hasn't met him, and that's not very many people left now. Um, on the one hand, he carried out the most extreme experiments in the history of the CIA and probably the United States. There's never been a government program that was this bloody and this savage in
Mm.
experimenting on people, so-called experiments. These experiments made Sidney Gottlieb undoubtedly the most accomplished torturer of his generation.
Wow.
Uh, And he didn't impose any limits on himself or the people he worked with in terms of the extremes to which they could go to try to destroy human beings.
Wow.
On the other hand, as you point out, people are a multiplicity of different factors. Gottlieb actually was a very unusual Washington figure. First of all, uh, he was hired at a time when the CIA leadership was almost all composed of the very same kind of people.
Mm.
They were all uh, well-to-do white males from the Northeast. They'd gone to the same prep schools, the same Ivy League colleges. They dated the same girls. They went to work for the same law firms or the same international banks. They belonged to the same yacht clubs and the same golf clubs. So it was a very inbred group. They were all the same. So
Yeah.
who did they pick to head the chemical division? But Sidney Gottlieb, who was the son of Orthodox Jewish immigrants. He
Huh.
went to City College. He had a limp. He stuttered. He went to Hebrew school. He was so different from all
Mhm.
the other CIA officers. And I think one reason they chose someone like that was that they knew this person was going to have to do horrific things.
Mm.
And that these things, who knows, might one day become at least in part public. Therefore, they wanted to have somebody who they could throw under the bus and
Mm.
blame it on who
Interesting.
wasn't part of their group.
Yeah.
Now, that's one way that Gottlieb was different, but the way he lived his life was also so different from that of any senior government civil servant during the 1950s. He lived deep in the Virginia woods in an eco cabin that had no electricity and no running water. He was like an early proto hippie. He got up before dawn to feed his goats. He brought vegetables to work for lunch. He meditated. He studied Buddhism. He wrote poetry. He became a community activist in acting in local plays. So he was known to the people around him as a very compassionate person and a loving, warm, friendly citizen. these are such different uh, people. It's hard to imagine how they fit in into one human. And I sometimes began to imagine that when Gottlieb would leave work at the CIA and drive across the bridge on his way home to Virginia, he would shed his torturer persona as he was maybe on the road. And then when he got out of his car at home, he was this completely loving, wonderful person. And then on the way back, he would take that skin back on again so that he would be like a little bit like a snake that sheds his skin. Each time he goes home, he changes into a different kind of person than when he comes into work and makes his foreign trips where he is securing what are called expendables, human beings that he can kill. He's in a completely different mindset. So I found Gottlieb to be probably the most gentle-hearted torturer you could imagine.
That's really fascinating that he would refer to them as expendables. And, I wonder to myself when you're talking, I wonder how much of this maybe subconsciously. Because what I found so surprising in my just learning about people, I'm just generally curious about human, I guess, the human condition, and I wonder if he ever, like, looked himself in the mirror and said, "I am a horrific person," or if maybe subconsciously, he was doing all of this stuff in his community to kind of balance out all the horrific things, like, "See, I'm not a bad person, I'm actually a good person. Look at all these wonderful things I'm doing in my community, and this stuff that I'm doing in the be in the for the CIA, this is all stuff that's going to be better for humanity in general. I'm doing these things because, yeah, sure, these are horrific things, but kind of almost like a Machiavellian, the ends justify the means type of thinking. And that compartmentalization, I think, is super important for people to hear because you think about those things and you think, oh, well, I would never do that. I don't know. This guy sounds like a pretty good dude in his normal life.
You're right. So I think that Gottlieb may have had this kind of reasoning. So naturally, as I was writing Poisoner in Chief, I was asking myself these same questions. How can this person have this bifurcated life? Um, so he never explained himself. In later life, he avoided all comment. I even saw a TV reporter kind of ambushed him and asked him about MKUltra, and he said, "That's in my past. It's going to stay there." So he never spoke about it.
Mm,
Then I decided to try to find his surviving adult children. And I focused on the older son who had quite an interesting career. Um, and I sent him a note. I didn't hear back. I looked him up on Facebook. I looked him up on Twitter. I sent him registered letters. I didn't hear anything back. And I was on my way out there to Wisconsin where he lives, just to, as in journalism, we call it to doorstop him, just to
mm,
stand outside his house and wait till he comes out until I found a person close to the family who explained why that son had never replied to any of my messages. And I was told that after Gottlieb died, his widow called the four children together, and told them never made them all promise never to speak about their father.
mm,
And so it was in compliance with that promise that I never heard back from the son or the other children. Now, that leaves me to speculate. How would Gottlieb have justified all of this?
sure.
And I came up with one theory. It's no more valuable than yours or anybody else's, but this is what I concluded might have happened in his mind. He might have thought to himself, I'm an offbeat person. I don't live like everybody else. I like to live my own kind of unusual, crazy life. And thanks to America, I'm able to do that.
Mm,
Thanks to freedom, I can be who I want to be.
mhm,
But if in this coming global conflict, the United States were to be destroyed and our nation taken over by the Soviets or by communists, it would be impossible ever for any human being to live like I do, to live according to his own mind. You wouldn't have your own mind. You'd be dictated to. Uh, so, in order to preserve the possibility of free human choice and existence, it's necessary to fight the enemy that wants to destroy that. So we built ourselves up into the idea that that enemy was the Soviet Union. That was the Soviet Union's goal, which it never was. Uh, and then once we convinced ourselves of that, it's a short step to concluding that something like a brutal torture program, MKUltra, is quite justifiable. And I think that might have been part of what was going through Gottlieb's mind, that he was protecting the idea of a free society by torturing and killing people.
Yeah, so just so people who may not be familiar with MK Ultra, we kind of already talked about how it was a torture program, poisoning mind control program. But could you probably give one of the aspects of this that I found so interesting was I have heard that the CIA actually ran or was involved with brothels in San Francisco as part of this, and were dosing Johns as they were coming in, as part of that. Can you get and maybe I'm wrong on that, or maybe I'm not. I'm thinking of that you're probably familiar with Tom O'Neill's book with regard to the connection between MK Ultra and Charles Manson. So I'm curious, could you give some the listeners a flavor of kind of what these experiments or these mind control torture programs were like?
So Gottlieb reserved his most horrific and extreme experiments for other countries. He
Mm,
did a lot of work in Germany, in Philippines, in Japan. These were countries that were under American occupation, and therefore there was no fear about local law,
mm,
and certainly didn't have to worry about U.S. law.
mhm,
So what he would do is ask the CIA station or the local military police to provide him with some human bodies,
mhm,
expendables as they were called,
mhm.
and then he would try out any of the huge variety of drug combinations that he had concocted. He used everything from sensory deprivation, loud noises, extremes of temperature. Um, in one case that we know about, for example, a guy was locked into a kind of a coffin like uh, box and fed extreme overdoses of sedatives to put him into a coma, and then immediately given extreme overdoses of amphetamines to get him hyperactive. And the idea was that maybe the interaction of those two overdoses would cause him to lose his mind. And we don't know whether they did or not, or whether the person involved in that experiment died. I told you about going to Germany and finding this CIA secret prison. The people in the neighborhood are aware of what happened in that house.
Mhm.
And some told me that the bodies of people that were killed in MK Ultra were buried in forests nearby that are now covered over with shopping malls and apartment blocks.
Jeez.
Uh, these extreme experiments were carried out in various parts of the world. Then Gottlieb carried out experiments inside the United States. One of the groups that he liked to focus on was prisoners. He had good relations with several prison wardens and prison doctors, and that would be obviously a place where he could find expendables because the prisoners are entirely under the influence of the wardens. So he was able to carry out experiments on prisoners in a number of U.S. prisons. We do have a description of one of those. Uh, at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, seven African American inmates were segregated and put into a cell and fed what were described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days.
Wow.
Presumably, the purpose of that experiment was to find out if that kind of a massive overdose would destroy a person's mind. And although we don't never got the protocol because it's been destroyed, my guess is, yeah, I think that probably would destroy a human mind. And I
Yeah.
always asked myself, what happened to those poor seven guys? Did they ever recover? Did they ever know what had
Mhm,
happened to them? Uh,
mhm.
so Gottlieb was willing to go to all kinds of extremes, and that includes this crazy piece of it that was called Operation Midnight Climax,
Yeah.
where Gottlieb actually opened a bordello in San Francisco, and working with a U.S. drug agent, he established an apartment on overlooking San Francisco Bay, all decorated with like Toulouse-Lautrec posters and sex toys. And then he hired women who would then bring their customers into that apartment where this overweight drug agent would be sitting behind a one-way mirror on a portable toilet, drinking cocktails that he poured out of a pitcher and watching what happened. So this was supposed to be an experiment to see if LSD or whatever drug that Gottlieb wanted the drinks to be spiked with that night uh, would produce some kind of results that could be useful for MKUltra. But in fact, it wasn't scientific at all. There was no science in it. There was just one fat guy watching people have sex. So you had this national security whorehouse that Gottlieb established, um,
Jeez.
and uh, I found it really strange. The only thing they ever came up with was the observation that sometimes when people have drugs and after sex they become talkative. But you didn't need to do all of that experimentation to conclude that. And who knows what the result was in the minds of those the victims. Of course, they were chosen because they couldn't complain. They had just
Right.
hired prostitutes, so they wouldn't be able to go to the police or tell their family what had happened. Um, so later, when I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I came up with a really interesting angle on the Bordello story that helped me explain possibly why he did that.
Hmm.
Um, and I dug. This is a really deep dive. I found a lawyer who had been involved in long-term litigation against Gottlieb and the CIA. And he's very old now. He had a garage full of old papers from all of that litigation. And in there, I found a deposition from one of the people who worked at that national security whorehouse, Operation Midnight Climax. And he said Gottlieb used to come and inspect the place. He used to come to visit
Hmm.
regularly. And every time he came, he wanted a girl. And I
Hmm.
would always get him one of my girls. And they never charged him. They all did it as a favor to me. And it made me think maybe that was the reason.
Hmm.
That was the whole project in the first place. Here you've got a middle-aged guy living with his family in the Washington suburbs, and he's got this chance to have a business trip where
Yeah.
it's to have unlimited amounts of women provided to him for free. So maybe the whole Operation Midnight Climax was only aimed at giving Sidney Gottlieb a midnight climax.
I guess so. Man, that sounds it's it's funny because you sit there and you go, "Well, he's a family man," and then you hear all the stuff he's done, and you're like, "Oh, that's not I mean, that would not even rank top 10 of the horrific things that he's that he's done." You know, in talking with you about this, I kept wondering, do we have any the record at all on whether any of these experiments were successful at achieving any of the goals that he had?
We don't have any records because when Gottlieb left the CIA in 1973, along with his mentor, Richard Helms, who was then the director of the CIA, the two of them decided to destroy all the records of MKUltra.
Oh,
That's a
wow.
federal crime. Destroying federal property is a felony. However, it's a much smaller crime than the crimes that would be described in the
Right.
MKUltra files. So Gottlieb actually found resistance at the CIA record center, the archive center. The archivist refused to destroy the records, and he had to drive out there. And at
Mm.
his personal order, those records were destroyed. 7 crates of records were shredded. And the archivist, I actually found his log. It says they were destroyed, quote, over my stated objection.
Wow.
So, uh, almost all of the original record of MKUltra has been destroyed, and the efforts of Gottlieb and his mentor Helms to make sure that nobody ever found out what really happened were largely successful. Um, so you asked, do we have any evidence that any of these experiments were successful? Uh, I think we have something like the opposite because Gottlieb himself, towards the end of the 1950s, began having doubts, and people in the CIA began thinking that this thing had gone completely out of control. And Gottlieb, in his very Buddhist way, not only pushed back against suggestions that MKUltra should be modified, but said, actually, we should go further. We should just abolish it. And the reason was, as Gottlieb put it, that essentially he concluded there is no such thing as mind control.
Mm,
Now, he had had psychologists like Carl Menninger writing to him and telling him this during the 1950s, but he didn't want to believe it.
mm,
Why did these guys come up with the idea that it was possible to
mm,
control people's minds? In other words, to say, seize the mind of a foreign leader and then speak through him,
yeah,
control him. What made them think this was possible? I think there were two reasons. One is their cultural conditioning for all the movies and all the short stories and all the books about hypnotizing somebody with a watch, and then he goes to the embassy and steals the secrets, or putting a pill in somebody's drink that makes them your slave. So they began to think of those things as real, even though they were fictional. And then there were a couple of episodes that the CIA misinterpreted as
mhm,
meaning that the Soviets were on the trail of
mm,
the mind control. Therefore, we had to do it. Um, so uh, at the very end, Gottlieb concluded that actually the whole project had been essentially a failure. That he came to the conclusion you cannot make somebody do something that he's fundamentally morally opposed to doing, like going out and committing a murder. That's
mhm.
just fiction. So when I look back at that now, I have to think that Gottlieb was right. He probably knew more about poisons and chemical toxins than anybody in the world. And I think when he concluded there's no such thing as mind control, he was definitely correct. However, he was correct when he said that. That was
Yeah,
around 1960. If
mm.
you look now at all of the developments in neuroscience and cyber technology and AI that have happened since then, it makes me wonder if that's still true. Maybe there was no such thing as mind control in the past, but could there be such a thing as mind control engineered in the future? Uh, could there be another book like Poisoner in Chief written decades from now about what was happening in the 2020s?
Yeah,
It, it's hard for me to imagine that there's nobody at the CIA or in the Russian or Chinese or any other secret service who's researching mind control possibilities. I don't have any information about this. It probably would be held just as secret now as it was in the 1950s. But it seems logical to me that there might be research like that going on right now. And what was true in 1960, there's no such thing as mind control, might not be permanently true.
so that was actually the question I had, the thing that's I think so fascinating about people in general. I think sometimes we look at these stories as characters rather than real people. Like people hear about Adolf Hitler and he's almost transcended humanity, or they hear Sidney Gottlieb and they go, "Oh, that would never happen." I would never be a Nazi. I would never do any of those things. Of course, I have morality, and all these things looking at it on hindsight. But man, I just can't help but think, I'm like, with technology the way that it is today, and with what we know, what we've already found out about the way that the FBI and the CIA have surveilled people and do things, it sounds like you do have a significant concern that this type of thing might be going on again or could possibly go on again.
The justification for MKUltra is, as I said earlier, this terrible existential fear that our enemies are all around us, they're about to crush us, therefore everything we do is justified. And in a way, I don't think the United States has transcended that mindset. We've always got there's an Ayatollah, there's Saddam, there's Castro. You always come up with these evil figures, and they're always after the United States. And we get this view that the U.S. is a tiny little beacon of goodness in the world, and all those evil forces out there are against us. Until we transition out of that mindset, it's always going to be tempting to
Yeah.
launch projects that are extreme because you believe that the danger is much more extreme than it actually is.
Mhm.
There's always an interest in people on the part of people in power to portray the current moment as absolutely crucial in the history of our country and the history of humanity. Um,
Every election in the last 12
is
years has been
is
the
the
most
most important
consequent.
election ever.
Yeah, most important election. Democracy's on the table every single time. Yeah.
So I think until we get out of that mindset that we're beset by enemies everywhere and we have to fight them, then the possibility remains that operations as extreme as MKUltra might be launched in the future or might be underway right now.
I think the scariest thing about this, so when I hear these things, is not necessarily that, like, these experiments happened. I don't think that that's the dangerous part. I think the more dangerous part is that I assume that all of these people, when they were doing them, were very intelligent, very well-meaning, and somehow were convinced that this was justified. And, it really speaks to the human condition that I think that if with enough fear, almost anything can be justified. And I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, do you think about those concerns, or do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, Alan Dulles, who was head of the CIA during the MKUltra period, once said that intelligence work should not be confused with the Boy Scouts, uh, which is a nice way of putting it. So I would answer this way. Um, Commitment to a great cause is perhaps the most powerful incentive to commit immoral or extreme acts.
Mhm.
Patriotism is one of the most noble causes of all and one of the most seductive.
Mm,
So, patriotism and ultranationalism can be manipulated
mhm.
to lead people to the conclusion that immoral acts are justified.
Yeah.
So once you allow these abstract ideologies to take hold of you and guide your actions, you begin to lose perspective and you begin to think that things are so extreme at this particular moment when I'm alive uh, that I'm liberated from all human constraints. And I feel like in some ways we're still in that era. We heard that kind of apocalyptic rhetoric before we invaded Iraq. We heard it about Syria. I mean, we always hear these things about poison gases, and
Yeah.
we're going to
Yeah.
be attacked. We have we're threatened on all sides. So I think before we can wash away the impulse to carry out these extreme projects, we have to transition out of that us versus them mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, so, it's funny, every time I have these conversations, I'm like, "I wish I just had you all day." I swear, because there's so much to talk about, and I just find this so fascinating. So I wanna, before we tell everybody where we can find you, I have a question for you. You mentioned you felt like you'd been in the room with Sidney Gottlieb, while you were writing the book, even though you never met him. If he were sitting on this podcast with us right now, and you could ask him any question, what would you want to ask him based on the research that you've done?
I think the big question is one that we discussed earlier. How could two such apparently opposite personas coexist inside one human mind? How do you justify this huge dichotomy between the side of you that was the compassionate community man and meditator and Zen Buddhist with being such an extreme torturer? Maybe his answer would have to do with the tenor of the times. Uh, but I wonder if looking back, he would ever regret what he did, or would he still say that it was all justified? I'll tell you this, at the very end of his life, Gottlieb looked like he was about to be put on trial for
Mm,
something that had happened, a guy that he had poisoned in the early 1950s whose family had never given up litigation. And it was put off for years and years. And finally, it was just about to come to trial. And Gottlieb was going to be called as a witness, and he would be called to testify under oath about what he had done. And just before that happened, he died.
mm,
This lawyer who was pursuing the case told me, I think he killed himself because he
mm,
didn't want to be the instrument by which all of this would become public. Uh,
mm.
so looking back, would he have had any regrets? I wonder. I'd like to ask him that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder if you asked him that question, how these 2 people could coexist if he just said, "No, they're the same person." Like, because if you think about it, I could see how someone could say, I'm fascinated with villains like Thanos from Marvel, where you're like, you go, he kind of has a strange, wild, weird point. Where you're like, it does save the environment to kill half the population of the universe, but you think that, I'm a community man. I mean, this is for the community, right? I mean, I'm doing this for my community, and this is important. And these are prisoners, and these are terrible people that should have been killed anyway. I mean, it's shocking what people can do.
Uh, MKUltra and Sidney Gottlieb are ultimate proofs of that reality.
Wow, that's just shocking. Well, so you have a book coming out in October, and we definitely want to have you come back and talk about that. Tell us about the book you have coming out.
I wrote a book some years ago called Overthrow, which is a history of American overthrows of foreign governments. So I've always been interested in the techniques and the ways the United States overthrows governments. Um, and I've written a new book about Ukraine, and it's not about the war. It ends actually when the war begins, but it's about 75 years of US intervention in Ukraine, trying to propel Ukraine into conflict with Moscow. So it's sort of like maybe a next chapter from the Overthrow book. So that book is called Boiling Point: How America Brought War to Ukraine. And I will look forward to seeing you in the autumn to discuss it.
Yes, absolutely. And in the meantime, if people want to follow you, where can they find you?
I have a website, so it's my name, stephenkinzer.com. And I post some of my columns on Facebook, but everything is on that website. And all of my 10 books are available. And you should, if you want to buy one of them, pick out the one you want on Amazon and then go down to your local independent bookstore and buy it there.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you giving me the time to come on here. It's been a fascinating discussion. I look forward to having you back in October. And I got to tell you, I got to commend you. You're obviously very passionate about this, and I love talking to passionate people about the things they're passionate about. And it's clear that you must feel fulfilled by the work that you do. That's
It's nice to chat with you, and it's nice to peel up a little bit of the carpet under which the dirt has been shoveled.
awesome. Awesome. Well, for those of you listening, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time.